Way back when, some kids might have gone home after school and popped in the hot new Super Nintendo, N64, or PlayStation game. Not little old me, not for a while. My household didn't have a traditional game console early on. What we did have, as far back as I can remember, was a Windows 95 computer, a CD-ROM drive, and a steady drip feed of educational games. My First Encyclopedia, Busy Town, The Magic School Bus, and Lenny's Music Tunes all peppered my childhood. But most of all, there was the JumpStart library and the Learning Company's collection. Rather than jumping around the Mushroom Kingdom or cavorting about Hyrule after school, I was guiding the Cluefinders to thwart the vile dragon Mathra or to stop an ancient Egyptian apocalypse. I was helping Botley the robot yank his robot friends back from the far-flung annals of time, or just collecting stamps around the schoolhouse with CJ the Frog. I was playing games, having fun, yes, but through these games, I was also learning, reinforcing what I had seen in the classroom. Most of all, I was enjoying that learning process. Even as I started playing more traditional video games, those educational gems formed a foundation for me. I could probably learn anything if the learning process was a suitably engaging game. And so I wondered, decades after that point in my life, what was the rhyme or reason to games like that? Were they little more than just colorful, interactive drills and challenges you could find just as easily on your homework sheets? Or, in the vastness of educational theory, learning methods, and praxis, were they more? I've looked back at my old educational video games, or Edutainment, to find out what makes them tick both as video games and as educational tools. Even with my rose-tinted, extremely nostalgic biases, when we examine both of those aspects of edutainment separately, we can see the potential those games had back when I was in school, and the medium's potential for students in school now and in the future. The most important part of any interactive experience, above story, above characters, above the neat little doodads players can acquire in-game, is the element of interactivity, how players manipulate the digital landscape. Think of a game's mechanics, jumping over obstacles to reach a goal, hitting monsters with a sword to save the princess, etc. At its core, interactivity is what differentiates a game from other forms of media. Researchers Plass, Homer, and Kinzer theorize that in edutainment, activities can primarily have a learning focus, learning mechanics, or an assessment focus, assessment mechanics, although in many cases they focus on both. Edutainment has a twofold goal for players. First, learning how to play the game by understanding the game's mechanics, controls, and goals. And secondly, learning how to win the game. You win by showing that you understand both the educational material to correctly answer the game's problems and how to show the game you understand through play. Distill it down to the classroom. You have a multiple choice question in front of you, and you know without a shadow of a doubt that the answer is C. You understand the material. But if you don't circle C or otherwise indicate that C is the answer, then there's no way to assess your knowledge in this subject. You have not shown that you understand the material, learning, and assessment. In JumpStart second grade's Ice Cave activity, players both have to know how to read mathematical equations and understand how the equations line up in order to freeze the bugs in every part of the grid. Once the grid is fully covered in frozen bugs, you win. You need to know how math operations work, but you also need to know how to manipulate the ice blocks to win, learning, and assessment. The study continues on that the game mechanic represents the essential behavior that is linked to learning or the assessment activity in a game. To win, you must both understand how to play to select the right answer, mechanics, and select the right answer by knowing how to play, learning. For example, in this JumpStart first grade activity, players drag the hand or marble to line up with the factor that needs to be removed from the equation in order to make it true. You can shoot marbles willy-nilly, but if you keep shooting the wrong marble to solve the equation, the gameplay element doesn't matter. You have to shoot the correct marble. In the classroom, simple as it seems, you can know how to circle the correct answer, but if you don't know the correct answer, then your mechanical knowledge of completion doesn't matter. Players don't normally acquire points for wrong answers. Likewise, if you can't manipulate the game to shoot the right marble, the game will never know that you have that section's knowledge. You need to understand both how to be assessed, playing the game, taking a test, and what you're being assessed on, the games or the lessons or the unit's content, in order to succeed and progress. Luckily, most edutainment games from that time were played with a mouse, and occasionally graduated into a simple arrow key spacebar control scheme. Even with those simple and rudimentary controls, edutainment games aren't there to challenge players on gameplay mechanics and mastery. They're there to challenge and reinforce educational lessons and skills. For example, in the JumpStart first grade cafeteria, players try to serve as many students their lunch as possible before a time limit runs out. There isn't a minimum amount that players need to serve to quote-unquote win. Frankie the dog is thrilled with their efforts and accomplishments no matter what. By lowering the skill barrier to interact with the game and still making the activities games of various sorts, edutainment titles can lean on the advantages of gameplay elements while maximizing educational exposure and challenge to players. Short version, gameplay and learning are intrinsically linked as part of the core loop of assessment. Gameplay makes the learning process more engaging, and learning makes gameplay more accessible than it would be in traditional video games. Ask anyone who's played an arcade game in the last few decades, or even who's picked up a side-scrolling Super Mario game before 2023, there's always a whisper of high scores or tracking one's score somehow. Nowadays, there are achievements, trophies, and leaderboards in all sorts of different games. Objectives push players forward, whether plot-related or not. Collect these things, overcome this obstacle, progress this plot. Even in-game, there is something daunting but ever so satisfying about filling out a vast upgrade tree for one's player character. Games motivate players in a myriad of different ways, sometimes changing and adapting with the times, sometimes carving out new ways to do so, but they are always pushing players forward. Edutainment games do likewise. From as far back as JumpStart first grade, players collect points by playing games and interacting with the world. Those points eventually become designer milk caps, the hot commodity of a mid-90s elementary classroom. Similarly, JumpStart second grade uses points to build up to a stamp collection and challenges players to receive postcards from pen pals across the 50 United States. In third and fourth grade, players must accumulate enough points to progress in the story. Even as a younger learner, I remember there being something uniquely satisfying about watching those numbers go up as I solved various problems. As the grade levels ascend, motivation and progression become more tied to the story and its objectives. Solve this problem, advance the story towards its conclusion. The Cluefinders series was all about overcoming obstacles and challenges in pursuit of an end goal and the natural end of a narrative. In Cluefinders third grade, for example, the Cluefinders set out to stop the titular monster Mathra from wreaking havoc in the rainforests of Numeria. By completing drills and problems, they are given the items they need to gain access to the key fragment that they need to access the final area, itself full of its own new drills and items to collect, and, ultimately, is where they can put a stop to Mathra's terror. Plass et al. Surmised that edutainment titles have been shown to be able to motivate learners to stay engaged over long periods through a series of game features that are of a motivational nature. By using these different motivators, edutainment incentivizes players to keep playing by tapping into their gamer brains, however young they may be. Numbers go up, rewards get collected, story progresses. Extrinsic rewards like points or in-game rewards also don't have any effect on gameplay. JumpStart 4th grade tracked full gameplay progress at the top right of the screen. 5,000 points yielded 1 key, and players needed 25 keys to move through Ms. Grunkle's haunted mansion to rescue their classmates. Once they had done that and reverted their classmates from monstrous transformations through set activity missions, they win the game. Intrinsic rewards are more akin to power-ups or abilities, things that do have an effect on gameplay. In games designed to challenge, teach, and reinforce educational topics, having power-ups might be more counterintuitive. It wouldn't be educationally beneficial to just be able to blast problems away when you couldn't solve them. Edutainment games maximize their appeal to players by dangling the potential for, albeit digital, rewards in front of them and incentivizing them along the path. Same as we do in traditional video games, just with a few more math problems. From our childhood storybooks onward, we have long been fascinated by stories. Plots and stories are a potential motivation for players in video games, and are reported to lead to increased positive feelings compared to games without narrative. Narrative has its place in edutainment as well. From 3rd grade onward, both JumpStart and the Cluefinders set up adventures with longer form narrative to follow, instead of the earlier grade level model of play activities, get points, get rewards. Plass et al. Note the following. Narratives provide contextual information for learning, connecting rules of play, characters, tasks, events, and incentives. They have a strong motivational function by contributing to a game's stickiness, that is, the desire it generates for people to return to play. Aside from serving as a motivation on their own, narratives can tie all sorts of different aspects of a game together, even edutainment. It answers why players are doing what they're doing, who they're doing it with, and what they must do. Let's look at JumpStart 3rd grade as an example. The rules of play are to venture throughout Mystery Mountain, collecting mission clues to rescue robots that have been sent through time by bratty kid genius Polly Sparks to alter key points in history. Polly doesn't seek temporal and chronological domination, she just wanted to make sure her botched history test at school was ultimately correct. Players are accompanied by Botley the robot, one of the robots who dodged this chronological catastrophe. Each task or activity is relegated to a different themed area. The kitchen works with fractions, the lab tests reading comprehension and science facts, and the training course uses logic and programming puzzles. Polly, the story's antagonist, will regularly pop up via monitor and taunt the player and Botley throughout the game, undermining victories both small and large. Lastly, the narrative incentivizes players by giving them a goal to work toward. Rescue 25 robots from different points in history, and in doing so, rewrite history back to normal. Researchers Melanie Green and Timothy Brock posit that the amount a student is absorbed in a narrative would affect the amount they were persuaded by such a narrative. Granted, their research was on written narratives, but a narrative is still a narrative. Who hasn't entered a flow state when watching a movie or playing a game that they enjoyed? Consumers of narrative find themselves absorbed, and in the case of edutainment, can find themselves more motivated to learn or attempt the material as a result of their absorption. If I don't at least try to do this thing I might not be good at, we'll never rescue this robot from the past. Lastly, researcher Osvaldo Jimenez conducted a study of fun with educational games using 2 conditions. Characters, which had characters interacting with players through a story as they solved problems, and abstract, which presented problems in an interactive, albeit more narratively sterile, setting. Jimenez found that students who were in the characters condition had significantly higher ratings of fun than students in the abstract condition, suggesting that a story seems to make an educational game more fun, which may lead to more engagement and motivation. Perhaps students are more apt to learn and understand math when doing so helps them stop a monster from ravaging the rainforests. Plots hook us in, draw us in, and make edutainment's learning process more fun and engaging than it would be without the plot. The narrative pervades so much that we enjoy. It is central to our society, our culture, our essence as people. Even for something like edutainment, narrative encompasses the who, what, where, why, and how all together, forming a singular, cohesive experience for players. It makes sense of the goal at hand and how you can achieve it, even in small part, by solving school-style problems in wacky ways. In any story, game or otherwise, there are characters. In games specifically, there is generally a player character, or an avatar that players control in some form or fashion. Sometimes characters and player characters overlap, giving players established characters to control. Super Mario's eponymous Mario, The Legend of Zelda's swordsman Link, or Metroid's bounty hunter Samus. Other games lean more heavily into the player character dynamic. This gives players a slate upon which to impress themselves, whether through narrative choices, mechanical build, character creation, or a combination of all three. Think the Dragonborn in The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, or Tav in Baldur's Gate 3. It's easy to overlook the edutainment characters as simply mascots, but they pull important duty as characters all their own. JumpStart games were never at a loss for characters. Frankie the dog would move around to the first grade school with you, a constant companion who would guide you through its many puzzles and challenges with fun quips and jokes in between, all directed to the player. CJ the Frog and Edison the Firefly took you under their wing in the second grade as you explored the caves and activities both around and under the schoolhouse. Botley the Robot enlisted your help to set the timeline straight after Polly's meddling. But they were more than mascots or screen fillers. These characters acknowledged you, the player, as you ventured through their various activities. You were a character in the adventures. Researchers Katie McClarty et al. Believe that by having students experience the game firsthand, as if they were truly in the situation, or by having a tutor speak directly with them, they were able to learn more than being in neutral third-person settings. It's the same science one can see in TV shows like Blue's Clues or Dora the Explorer. Engaging directly with viewers, or players, can yield more involvement and investment. In the case of games, it yields a higher level of involvement to engage in the activities because the characters are encouraging you. As time goes on and players graduate to more advanced grade levels, the characters start to step back from the player. Flap the Bat was always around in 4th grade, but would only show up on screen to teach the mechanics of an activity or when summoned. Earlier characters, by contrast, were always around and visible to help. The separation was fully realized in 5th grade. There, players were no longer themselves, as it were, but instead controlled Jo Hammett, kid detective, as she skateboarded around Hooverville to stop the evil Dr. X's plots. Jo never acknowledged the player directly, instead speaking in monologues like a detective would in a pulp noir mystery. Though this character design may clash a bit with McClarty's research, it picks up the slack from the narrative department. By upping the ante to domestic terrorism prevention, players are more invested in foiling these plots than they are hung up over Jo never acknowledging them directly. The Cluefinders were more player characters as well. They never acknowledge the players themselves, but pull more weight from the narrative end of things as characters with goals, generally rescuing someone from their group or family. Additionally, all of the main Cluefinders are distinct human characters. Unlike the mainline JumpStart mascots, players could project themselves onto the Cluefinders. There are both girls and boys. Racially, Joni is white, Santiago is Latin American, Leslie is Black or African American, and Owen is Asian American. Each, while linguistically American, speaks with varying dialects and vocabulary. In these ways, a greater number of students and players can see themselves in a member of the team, something that risks being lost in less human or more homogeneous character design choices. The characters in JumpStart both grew with and accommodated their players as they advanced in grade level. On the flip side, the peer-like Cluefinders walked parallel to players, making the adventures more accessible through characterization. Over time, both sets of characters gradually handed the reins of gameplay and control fully over to players. Specifically, moving from JumpStart 4th grade to 5th grade was like a graduation of sorts, from one form of storytelling and independence to another. Difficulty will be covered more exhaustively in the next section, but note this. Games, especially since becoming commonplace in households, tend to have the option of adjusting difficulty. Easy, medium, and hard are the old standbys, and edutainment games use this to full effect, but on a per-activity basis. Players start at a baseline level and can increase or decrease that difficulty based on how much trouble they're having or how easily they're burning through an activity. Oftentimes, to revisit motivation and incentive from earlier, higher difficulties yield more points, yielding more in-game goodies. A number of traditional video games are only just adopting this dynamic, that of allowing players to adjust their difficulty partway through a game, but that's a ramble for another day. All the same, Edutainment reflects difficulty tiers in traditional video games, giving those experiencing mastery a greater challenge and the chance for more rewards, and likewise lowering the hurdles if a player is having difficulty with some material in particular. Per Plass et al., Edutainment's visual aesthetic design, or simply aesthetic, constitutes the information representation of the multimedia learning aspects of the game. It is also linked to the narrative of the game by expressing its aesthetics. First, it visualizes the learning challenges throughout the game as more than just problems to be solved. Second, it helps define and cement the narrative through use of visuals. Using JumpStart 3rd grade again, the game takes place within Mystery Mountain, a high-tech, science-centric inventor's dream world, occupied by any number of robots and androids. The general aesthetic marries the natural formation of the mountain with the scientific and technological augmentations made by its residents, reinforcing the high-tech, high-science plot of, we need to get these items to activate a time machine to pull these robots back from messing up the timeline. Similarly, the aesthetic pervades the gameplay as well, exploring and manipulating the many rooms, galleries, and labs throughout the mountain in order to triumph over their challenges and acquire critical items or points. There is no point where the game simply tells players, hey, solve this problem because you gotta. There's a reason for doing so. Saving a clue from getting sucked into a black hole, recharging the mountain's power supply, feeding a robot friend in exchange for his help, needing to open doors in order to progress, all of it is presented visually in the game as a challenge to overcome, not just drills of problems. For example, learners need to get into the kitchen of Mystery Mountain to progress in their mission. Unlocking the kitchen door, however, requires 3 correct math equations to access the activity on the other side. There is a narrative reason, albeit loose, for the activity. Musical score and sound design are also big contributors to games, both educational and traditional. Plass et al. Note sound design's major boons in edutainment as to provide background sounds that are often used to direct the player's attention to specific important events or moments in the game, signal the presence of danger or opportunity, induce positive or negative emotions, or acknowledge the success or failure of a specific task. Sometimes it's as simple as a positive sounding ding on a correct answer or a buzzer for a wrong answer, the hooing of ghosts as they chase you through a maze, or the skittering of ice beetles signal a threat or danger, something to either avoid or defeat, depending on the activity's mechanics. The music composition, similarly, may get players amped up for a time-sensitive activity, forebode some kind of threat, help to reinforce the aesthetic or setting, or be absent completely if a situation calls for it. Voice acting is also a crucial element of sound design in edutainment. Having characters talk to and refer to the players directly helps to draw them into their learning potential. But, as can be expected, not just any voice will do. Characters interacting with or being controlled by players should have a relatable quality to them, be this in tone, acted age, or levels of enthusiasm. The mascots in JumpStart are often portrayed as older guides to the players, dropping down to the player level by the time they play as Joe Hammett in 5th grade. The older guides have an air of knowledge about them, but approachability as well. They are smart and able to help, but not authoritative. With Joe and other characters like the Cluefinders, they are given personalities that shine through in their voice acting, establishing them as believable and, for a school-age player, compelling characters. Another phenomenal example of voice acting, and acting in general, is Lynn Thigpen's Chief of Acme in the Carmen Sandiego series, a demanding but encouraging authority figure for players who, in equal measure, celebrates their victory and helps pick them up after their defeats. Voice acting, in a learning-based medium, acts as a bridge for players who may struggle more with reading and language arts elements. Often people learn to talk and listen before they learn how to read and write. This way, the widest range of learners can be engaged without unintentionally gatekeeping those who struggle with words from progress. Lastly, there is something to be said for the non-game, non-educational elements of edutainment games, largely in the earlier grade levels, the exploratory elements. Other games catered towards children in that era, think Humongous Entertainment's lineup like Pajama Sam, Freddy Fish, etc., all prided themselves on their whole worlds being interactable. Just click on something on the screen, and something might happen. The results were often silly and had nothing to do with advancing the game, but for a curious and inquisitive player, they're a fun break from the usual. They encourage and reward exploration and curiosity. Even in edutainment games, it's important to consider that not everything needs to be, or should be, educational all the time. Learners need a break. Why else would we have recess in school? As an audience and as consumers, we can fail to notice certain aspects of our consumed media. Long takes, lighting, angles in TV shows and movies, even word choice and sentence structure in books. Same with games. It can be easy to get immersed and lose oneself in the atmosphere, the overall narrative, the aesthetic, and the gameplay elements, and lose sight of the minutiae of what makes it properly tick, what makes it all flow together. With edutainment titles, or at least well-designed edutainment titles, it's easy to overlook those cohesive elements when players are being bombarded with parts of speech matching and geographic trivia. But if those elements weren't tying the experience together, the titles wouldn't hold players' attentions. Short version, games need and thrive on certain elements to be games. And by using those, edutainment titles put a foot in the door to engage young players and learners exactly where they're at. I was in a secondary education program for most of my time at college. If I can boil down everything I learned in those classes, it would be that education thrives on smaller student-to-teacher ratios. The fewer students each teacher needs to work with at a time, the more individualized their attention and teaching can become. This, theoretically, gives teachers a chance to zero in on students' particular learning quirks and struggles to help them excel as much as they can. As it stands in my own K-12 education, and many others in more recent years, we have yet to start properly applying that dynamic, forcing educators and curriculum to be more generalized in the hopes that the skills and information sticks with the largest number of people. Edutainment games are a tricky alternative. On the one hand, they lack authentic and personal human elements that, in theory, make in-person learning so well suited for younger students. On the other hand, they excel at the one student to one teacher concept. This is an experience designed for one learner at a time through difficulty levels, engagement, and individual attention. Plass et al. Lay out 4 functions of games, each describing what learning goal the content of a title covers: preparation for future learning, teaching new knowledge and skills, practicing and reinforcing existing knowledge and skills, and developing 21st century skills. Even behind the veneer of plot and progress, edutainment games are still very much about the transfer and reinforcement of knowledge and skills. Activities, fun as they have the potential to be, are still drills in a particular subject area. Just as one would experience in traditional schooling, assessment comes into play with these activities, but not through traditional letter grades or percentages of right and wrong. McClarty et al. Go into greater detail that assessment occurs as the game engine evaluates players' actions and provides immediate feedback. Players make progress, or they don't. One can see this simpler style of assessment in the noises that often play in edutainment activities. Affirmative ding noises for right answers, negative buzzing noises for wrong answers, or the guide characters commenting on both right and wrong answers. Plass et al. Elaborate, discussing dynamic assessment, that games for learning are often designed intentionally in ways that require players to engage in specific activities that will provide information about the learner's knowledge or skills. If a player is having trouble with a particular activity, the game may constructively intervene, whether to provide assistance and explanations outright, as in the JumpStart games, or remind players that they can reach out for help, as with the Cluefinders video phone. Again, the perks of being able to individualize learning through games is that the player gets their own personalized learning experience, even if they have to stop and have concepts reinforced in order to progress. In JumpStart 3rd grade, there is an H button for help on the utility belt. Other titles use a question mark or a click on me function with their mascot characters. Although it varies from title to title, it's always reinforced at the beginning and throughout a player's time. Likewise, in Cluefinders, the red video phone used to call for help and guidance is visible at all times, and characters will prompt its use if a player seems to be having trouble with an activity. Research goes on to note the cognitive foundations of game-based learning: situatedness and transfer of learning. Concentrate on situatedness. Edutainment is also perfect for the age-old student question of, when will I ever have to use this? Through games, learning can take place in a meaningful and relevant context by providing information at the precise moment when it will be the most useful to the learner. For example, by giving information needed by learners to solve a problem at the time they are trying to solve it. Situatedness can pop up through the aforementioned dynamic assessment elements, or, especially in earlier grade level titles, the explanation of learning elements as it pertains to the activity at hand. The most salient example is in Long Addition. Characters will explain when to carry numbers over, why they do that, and move on to the next column, guiding players as needed until they understand. As an aside, this was a fun surprise when I revisited the earlier titles. I had to revert back to an older style of learning, the basics, instead of my old-timer mental addition. You can see this progression between 2nd and 5th grade. In JumpStart 2nd grade, CJ will explain this whole process to bring learners along, while players in 5th grade will have to work it out step by step on their own, unless they prompt Joe for guidance. The transfer of learning is the culmination of each activity, combining their proposed low and high road applications. Low road being the repetition of a practiced skill, like the drills in the various activities, and the high road being the abstraction of the knowledge. I have to do these drills in order to feed this frog the tasty bugs that they want. That learning information, whether in the form of teaching or guidance, is provided contextually, only as players encounter the need for it. This prevents them from being overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of information the game, or the educational system at large, wants them to retain at once. Though the bane of many math-focused learners, earlier grade-level edutainment titles rely on players, in a sense, showing their work. They move piece by piece, not necessarily solving an entire problem at once, but solving its parts before it comes together as a whole. Long Addition, again, is the most salient example. The game asks you to solve for each column, not the total sum. Researchers Peña Miguel Noemi and Sedano Hoyelos Maximo discussed this concept of step-by-step tutoring and its importance. First, because it facilitates the learning process. Secondly, because tutoring guides users in fulfilling their aims during the game. And thirdly, because it provides a monitoring mechanism for preventing inappropriate behavior on the part of users. Again, CJ walks players through the math steps individually, ensuring an understanding of the process before acknowledging a correct answer. As strangely phrased as it is, the inappropriate behavior could be something like using a calculator to solve the problem. The game can effectively force players to slow down and take each part one step at a time. It's not the solution, but knowing how to get to it, understanding the process, that matters the most in such teachings. Difficulty and challenge are the key to an equitable, inclusive educational experience. Too often in general education, students are either left behind as the average learning speed overtakes them, or they're left to stagnate as the average learning speed trails far behind them. Difficulty bridges the gap between those who need more guidance and those who need more challenge. Difficulty and challenge options make education more equitable for everyone. To explore difficulty in more traditional terms, consider a gold standard of adaptive difficulty in video games. Capcom's Resident Evil 4 from 2005, in which players control a member of the United States Secret Service on an assignment to rescue the president's daughter from parasitic zombies and nefarious cults. When players begin, there is only one standard difficulty, no sliders, no options. But the game adapts to the player's skill level behind the scenes. If the player is having trouble on a particular section, fewer enemies appear on subsequent retries. They stand around longer, allowing for easier targeting, and are generally less aggressive. Conversely, if players are burning through the challenges like they're nothing, RE4 ramps up enemy aggression, the damage they deal, and the number of enemies players must contend with at a time. The sliders are all in the background, controlled by the game based on the player. Now, translate that same dynamic to edutainment games. Plass et al. Describe adaptivity as the capability of the game to engage each learner in a way that reflects their specific situation. This can be related to the learner's current level of knowledge, to cognitive abilities, to the learner's emotions, or to a range of other variables. As players demonstrate their respective skill levels in challenges, the game may adapt itself one way or another, lessening the difficulty to ensure that struggling students understand the core elements first and foremost, or ramping up the difficulty when they've demonstrated mastery over a certain level. Traditionally, though, the older titles are locked into the easy, medium, hard trichotomy. This still leaves room for the learner to adjust the difficulty to their needs if the game won't adjust itself. However, if you ask some gamers, lowering the difficulty is a sign of weakness. They would rather struggle than concede. Similarly, if you ask a student point blank, "Do you understand?" and leave it in their hands to adjust their own difficulty, they're just as likely to struggle in a position they're not equipped for, or worse, stop trying. Luckily, most edutainment titles start off on a low, or the lowest, difficulty for all activities and challenges, escalating only when players decide to challenge themselves further, or when they've demonstrated mastery over a certain difficulty. For example, in JumpStart 2nd grade, I watched as my difficulty icon went from Scout, easy, to Explorer, medium, when I completed an activity with no errors and little effort. Edutainment titles also permit some leeway for students still struggling on that standard difficulty, allowing the ability to decrease the difficulty lower than the starting point. In traditional education, scaffolding is a method of a teacher demonstrating how to solve a problem, and then allowing learners to solve the problem with support only as needed. Plass et al. Go on to discuss scaffolding and relevant feedback in edutainment, that appropriate support is given in areas of gameplay where the player is having trouble, thereby providing dynamic feedback to scaffold learning of gameplay. Edutainment games, and arguably games in general, rely on scaffolding, presenting a problem and instructions on how to solve it, and then loosing players on a similar problem to solve, providing support as needed. In traditional games, they just call it a tutorial. For example, in JumpStart 3rd grade, players are instructed to unscramble the words to form a complete sentence, or in Cluefinders 3rd grade, told to rearrange numbers to make the highest even or odd number, or some other solution. Or, in JumpStart 4th grade's division activity, difficulty ramps up in each round by hiding the number answers behind a tombstone after your vampire passes by them once. You have to mentally remember the number's locations, touch that tombstone again to show the number, or try to avoid those numbers you don't need altogether so you can see them clearly when their equation pops up. In the search for one's individual challenge level, one must come to grips with the certainty of failure. Eventually, players will hit a wall that they can't overcome with their skill set, and they will fail. Research posits the concept of graceful failure as a more positive alternative to a red X or C me on an incorrectly done assignment. Failure, as they describe it, is both an expected and necessary step in the learning process, no matter what traditional education might have had you believe. Games, both educational and otherwise, can also operate from a place of lowered consequences, which encourages risk-taking and experimentation, elaborated on by Maja Pivek and Paul Kearney. Whereas risk-taking in traditional education might result in a lower grade, risk-taking in edutainment means exploration, trying new things, finding your way individually. In granting learners a safe and graceful way to fail, they put more control back into the hands of the player, encouraging them to persevere in a way they might not otherwise get to in a traditional classroom. In terms of the games, players don't suffer point penalties or negative ramifications to the story. They just try again, safe and graceful. Lastly, there's the concept of mastery, or at the very least, comprehension in edutainment games. McClarty et al. Note that in traditional classroom settings, a student that does not master a concept could be left with a gap in their knowledge foundation that challenges later attempts to build to more complex concepts. In contrast, digital games inherently force the player to master a concept in order to advance. For example, the double jump with a dash in midair to get across the pit of lava. Players are able to repeat the same scenario until they master this concept. Similarly, through the use of graceful failure, individualized difficulty, and scaffolding, edutainment games force the need to master into its design. Many activities, and as such, educational topics like fractions or environmental science, require some degree of success in order to fully win the game. Mission-specific clues or necessary items are hidden behind certain activities, or a pen pal is asking a question that you can only get the answer to by overcoming certain challenges. In effect, players are free to play around in other areas of the game, but they are locked out of progressing until they can demonstrate some grasp on whatever they're struggling with. In time, they'll have demonstrated a comprehension, if not a mastery, of all the subject matter the game has to offer. So even if learners aren't great at the language arts activities in JumpStart 4th grade Cemetery, they will have to complete it any number of times in order to help their classmates and ultimately win the game. Same with the other activities on the Haunted Island. Even if it's not a strength area, they will have to learn the material somehow in order to overcome the experience as a whole. Malcolm Bauer, former professor at Carnegie Mellon University, notes that rewards can go way beyond simple stars. Variation can be a reward for good work. Better questions, in other words, and more difficult tasks. Edutainment thrives in its variety and its individuality. Learners can take whatever time or resources they need in any number of subjects to gain an understanding without fear of being left behind by the collective. Edutainment games, based on both my recollection and research, are all about building up students and laying solid foundations. Scaffolding, adaptive difficulty, and breaking down each part of the target information all come together for a solid learning experience, but what keeps separating edutainment from traditional education is the grading report. Players are not given letter grades because edutainment holds itself as a long-term process. In both the JumpStart and Cluefinders series, these take the form of report cards or progress reports. A student's mastery of a subject is given in terms of their successful attempts against their total attempts. Even if a learner is absolutely tanking in some particular subject, they're never a failing student. The game just continues to shift to accommodate that student's needs so as to steadily narrow that gap between successful and total attempts. While there are any number of lessons and skills like long-form writing that edutainment games flat out cannot replicate in a game, traditional education can take some pointers from these games and their approaches to education as well. Ben Sawyer says that a serious game, the same that I've referred to as edutainment, must include two dimensions, the serious dimension and the playful dimension. If edutainment games are solid both as educational ventures and as games separately, that leaves us with the blending of the two. The combination of both strong gameplay for their target audience and strong educational qualities come together to create something that may last much longer in a learner's mind than the thrill of a traditional game or the lessons they receive in school. At school, students' lives are planned out by the minute. Different periods, different subjects, all scheduled out. The rigidity can be good in some senses, but edutainment titles give learners more slack in their approach. Players may have long-term goals they want to achieve in-game that require them to complete a certain activity or subject, but they are not forced to do so if they don't want to. If a player is more interested in something else, whatever their reason, they can partake in that. McClarty et al. Discuss how this gives students control and choice over their learning, a sense of agency and autonomy. All of the JumpStart titles and all of the graded Cluefinders titles allow players to play in any activity and subject area they want to, whether freely in-game or as a separate practice mode. Especially for younger learners, it can be paramount to help them feel like they have some degree of control in their lives. The elevator in JumpStart 2nd grade takes players to any activity or hub they want to go to, whether they need to for a postcard quest or not. Similarly, all activities on JumpStart 4th grade's Haunted Island are available to play, regardless of the story-related need to complete certain activities. That autonomy comes back to the difficulty settings in such titles. Players find their ideal experience by adjusting the difficulty according to their skill level. McClarty et al. Go on to note that well-designed games, as with well-designed education experiences, are challenging but achievable. The rewards of education of a great many games come from the struggle of challenge giving way to the release of achievement. Too difficult, and it feels unfair. Too easy, and it feels unearned. As previously noted, this is where we lose any number of students in traditional education. They either can't keep up with or are bored by the standardized speed. This autonomy in edutainment titles could be something, a small thing, but still something, that can keep such students sustained in the grand scheme of traditional education. Noemi and Maximo run parallel to this point of a player or learner-centric experience. By making the learning experience such a positive one, edutainment titles greatly increase the potential for training and learning. By introducing educational elements in simple, dynamic ways and turning them into the protagonists of their own learning processes, learners are more apt to engage with and learn from the titles. They continue, the aim of serious games go beyond pure amusement. They seek to be a mechanism that reinforces learning in a dynamic, interactive, motivating, and entertaining way. The hook is the gameplay and narrative elements, and the line is the collection of educational elements along the way, combined in this constructive way. In JumpStart 5th grade, players have to solve math equations and rearrange tiles to unlock a door that leads to a bomb that needs defusing. You're doing schoolwork, but in doing so, you're progressing the story. Jirki Kasvi lists 7 requirements for an effective learning environment, suggested by Donald Norman in Things That Make Us Smarter. They are as follows. 1. Provide a high intensity of interaction and feedback. 2. Have specific goals and established procedures. 3. Be motivational. 4. Provide a continual feeling of challenge, not too difficult to be frustrating nor too easy to create boredom. 5. Provide a sense of direct engagement on the task involved. 6. Provide the appropriate tools that fit the task. And 7. Avoid distractions and disruptions that destroy the subjective experience. After everything discussed in this project, you may agree with Kasvi's take that video games in general fulfill all of these requirements and that they satisfy them better than most other mediums. The difficulty is in developing a learning curriculum appropriate for different schooling levels, but that's already baked into a lot of edutainment titles. JumpStart 2nd grade, Cluefinders 5th grade. The titles are designed for a snapshot in a learner's educational journey, not designed to accompany them from grade level to grade level. One can argue that a developer like JumpStart or the Learning Company can accompany the learner from earlier grade levels on up as they progress, providing varying titles as the learners advance in grades, growing with the students in a gameplay sense. To date, as far as I know, there is yet to be an all-encompassing monolithic edutainment title that attracts learners in a multi-grade spectrum, for example from 1st to 6th grade. One can also argue that this is why education has leaned away from the singular schoolhouse model, in which all learners are in the same building, and why we operate now on a more rigid structure of grade levels. For as much as we struggle now with the ratio of educators to students, it would be catastrophic to attempt that between grade levels. Pivek and Kearney draw a parallel between all types of education, that motivation begets achievement. If a student in school is motivated to learn, the likelihood that learning outcomes are achieved increases. Plass & Co., in the same vein, discuss the motivational foundation of game-based learning, both in terms of intrinsic motivation, like challenge, curiosity, and fantasy, core elements of game design, and values and interests, game mechanics, modes of play, the use of collectibles, etc. Whether to collect in-game items, to progress a narrative, or whatever the motivation of the game is, edutainment titles provide that motivation to learn through providing experiences that players enjoy and want to continue. I wondered for some time, what is the full scope of those edutainment titles I'm so fondly attached to? Were they learning and teaching instruments all their own, or were they supplements to traditional education? I believe, given their state both in my memories and after revisiting them, that they were strange hybrids depending on the grade level. With the JumpStart series as my prime example, it seems as though earlier titles, like 1st and 2nd grade, concentrated more on the teaching elements with heavy emphasis on reasoning and showing your work. They were extensive, but by no means exhaustive in their subject coverage. Higher grade levels, like 4th and 5th grade, concentrated more on the supplemental aspects, less interested with teaching the material and more interested in making it a reinforcing challenge for learners based on what they've experienced in the classroom. Both sides of the spectrum are emphasized differently depending on the grade level, never providing a full educational experience like in the classroom. McClarty et al. Elaborate on this, that video games can be used to create deeper learning experiences for students, but they do not provide the entire experience. They cite other sources in positing that games are more powerful as a tool within education rather than an entire contained education. Games, they note, are not likely to replace teachers and classrooms, but may, in time, replace some textbooks and laboratories, a powerful supplement to a traditional education. The more I think of my original question now, it becomes less of an either-or binary. Edutainment titles were a powerful tool for me to have as a young student, but it was all relegated to home, to after-school time. How much more powerful could they be if the allure of games, combined with the rigor of academia, could be properly harnessed, sanctioned, and used within schools? Douglas Clark, a professor of learning sciences and science education at Vanderbilt University, said the following: "There's been this emphasis on whether games are better than traditional instruction, but that's not really a helpful distinction because it's not an either-or concept. The research shows that games as a medium can be effective, but not always. Design is really what matters. Nobody assumes that all lectures, labs, or books are good simply because of their medium. That's always been edutainment's greatest hook. It involves the players and learners in a way that other forms of learning can struggle to do. A lecture can be a scattershot, as likely to hit its mark as it is to miss entirely. For the interested, it's easy to engage with and glean something from it. For anyone else, easy to feel it go in one ear and out the other. Tell me, and I forget. A classroom lesson can be catered to a group of students, focused into ever more concentrated methods and practices to make the material stick with this group, these students. Teach me, and I remember." And a well-made edutainment title can make a genuine difference in a student's time in school. It can grow with them at their pace in terms of grade level and difficulty. It provides some form of motivation to keep learners coming back again and again. It's just fun. It is, when done well, a game. And games are meant to be played, to be enjoyed. Designed well enough, I can think of precious few people who would turn down a game. Involve me, and I learn.